Hello there, and welcome to Big Bad Con Unearthing the Tropics. I will be your temporary panel moderator, and joining me are two to three amazing guests. Uh, First of all, we have Pam Punzlan, a queer game designer working in Manila. Her professional work includes Journeys Through the Radiant Citadel, Hunter, The Reckoning, Starfinder, Spire, and Thirsty Sword Lesbians when not working on the official Dagger Isles supplement for Blades in the Dark and about 1,000 other things. Uh, Pam is also one of the two winners of the Big Bad Con Morgan Ellis Award this year. So, a round of applause in the Twitch chat. We also have BJ, an actuary, RPG game designer, and online GM for hire. He examines aspects of Philippine myth and culture and integrates them into RPGs. Along with his friends from Malaysia, Singapore, and the Philippines, he helped pioneer the RPGC hashtag. And we may have Mahar joining us. Mahar Menegas is a queer game designer from the Philippines who currently lives and works in Hong Kong. They make games that are meaningful tools that reflect their cultures and backgrounds in music, theater, education, and dramaturgy. So, and Mahar's work has ranged from cultural sensitivity consulting, art, and narrative design, including games such as Fate of Umdar and Enoch's Guide to the Infinite Void. So, I'm just here to give some basic introductions and get things started, and then I will cede space for this fascinating topic about unearthing the tropics. So, what is unearthing the tropics? How have you experienced the challenges of presenting worlds and experiences that folks in North America and Europe other, and how do you deal with decolonization and decolonizing our understanding of the concept?
So, one of the main reasons why I got together with BJ and Mahar in particular for this panel is because we already have the whole division of global north and global south happening, but we also understand that nobody actually calls it the global north unless they have like a particular reason to do so, but they almost always refer to global south. So, the entire exercise of already othering is happening, and a lot of people aren't even really aware of that. So, the goal of this panel is kind of start to touch upon the idea that the tropics is a political concept and that politicization comes from an area of needing to reduce and minimize what that is for easy consumption, usually done by people from what many of us refer to as the West or the white spaces. So we're also kind of hoping to go a bit into design work because we understand that talking about these high level stuff we also understand that talking about high level stuff is great, but then like moving it into design is like an entirely different sphere. So, BJ, do you have anything to add to that?
For me, I think when I when I think about the topic of unearthing the tropics, one of the big things for me is that it's kind of a personal thing whenever I read an RPG, and especially when they present something. It happens in two things. When they present something that they expect as natural because of their environment, and by there I mean people in the West, in the global North, and on the other hand, when they try to depict the tropics, neither of these things feel very natural to me when I read them myself. So I guess one example is that it's so common when they talk about nature magic to talk about it in the sense of the four seasons: summer, winter, autumn, and spring. And we don't have that. So when I'm trying to use a magic system that uses the four systems and try to localize it to to a Southeast Asian context, a lot of times either there's a lot of design work that I need to do, which is difficult because I'm supposed to just GM, for example, or I have to just not use that system entirely. And on the other
Mhm.
hand, when we're talking about the tropics,
Oop.
depicted as a hot, sweaty, dangerous, mosquito-laden place. And I'm like, are you sure? Are you sure you really hate this place? You all like to vacation here. So
Yeah, I remember that anecdote from that always comes up, right? Especially when the two of us got together for the islands of Sinuna, because that whole exercise was, this is going to be a fantastical Philippines. And of course, we all come from backgrounds, or at least the two of us come from backgrounds of reading books from World of Darkness, D&D, Pathfinder, and all the, and Legend of the Five Rings. And that's an entirely different discussion, right? Because that goes into uh, Orientalism and East Asia. So if it comes up, it comes up between the two of us, and hopefully when if Mahar gets here. But the fascinating thing as well is people usually assume that tropics means mystery, and the tropics also means danger, and that's often paired in a lot of TTRPGs books is what BJ mentioned already, which is it's supposed to be ultimately a place that you can conquer for yourself. It's an area or a land to be discovered. It's a place full of unknown wonder, and it's also, unfortunately for the way that they frame it in design, is it's a place of people that are different from you and have other values, but those values might be ones that you can take for yourself, while also teaching these other people how to be civilized, right? So that's a whole lot already to look into. But we m- what's difficult for, let's say, Philippine readership of tabletop RPGs prior to this explosion of RPGC, right, is that we all grew up reading books that framed the tropics this way, when our reality of living in the tropics is very different from how it's presented. So lots of people love to focus on the bugs and the heat and the mugginess, and creating all sorts of weird mechanical issues that come with living or dealing with the tropics, right? Like I remember reading some old works about how, since it's going to be too hot or too sweaty, you might take penalties to blah 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 blah. And while some white folks have tried to argue with me that, like, oh, it's the same for winter, and I'm like, you don't get it. Like, you barely talk about you barely focus on the othering that happens when you talk about my space, right? I can't, of course, I'm grasping for specific examples of this. But I'm not as familiar as BJ might be with some of the more bigger books or traditional RPGs and how they used to do it. So if you have any
should
examples
I
for me.
mention them by name? I'm not sure. But hey, to bounce off of that, it's that's not like a lot of places that are inspired by European fantasy, which is basically almost everything, right? It's not like we call these places winter home, right? I suppose you have Winterfell, but
Yeah, I was gonna say Winterfell represent there. I mean,
yeah, but that's one place in your continent. It's not the whole land. Whereas
Mm,
when you talk
true.
about something like the tropics, it's usually like you're generalizing this entire place as a place of wetness and heat and sickness. Like I, for example, this is possibly because of also what I prefer. I do prefer like systems that are in the OSR or old school milieu, and because of that, there's a lot of exploration there. But and that also hits at me because exploration does not necessarily should not imply colonization. You could explore a place. I go to different places all the time that is not the Philippines. Well, before the pandemic,
Mm.
and it's not like I saw a thing that I like and I'm like I should totally own that. it's That's not how we think. But a lot of the way a lot of games in the milieu of the type of game that I like present this present our locations is a place that you can loot, you can plunder, and you can dominate. Like even modern RPGs, like there's a modern tropical setting wherein there's a lich, there's a jungle, um there's a lich, and there's a jungle, and the basic idea there is that you are from outside the tropics. You're not native to the tropics, and you're here to impose order that was lost because of this lich. And uh, it's kind of weird because you finally visited a tropical place, and yet you're still coming from an outsider's perspective.
Um, as a another thing that even I have noticed, which has got to be bad, uh, all of these Western and very white games tend to have one culture. There is the one tropics culture. That's the only
Uh-huh.
tropics culture.
Tropical land.
It is. It's Tropicana. I mean, it's as opposed to, I mean, how many islands are there in the Philippines? Over 1,000?
7,100 something.
7,100.
7,000?
Seven
Like,
thousand one hundred seven. There you go.
yeah.
Got it.
No,
Someone's used
I
that
get the
number.
impression it's more than one homogenous culture going
Mm-hmm.
on
Mm-hmm.
just in one country.
And even the modern countries that we have are political boundaries. Like
Yes. Yeah.
it's not like the Philippines is a distinct entity from like Indonesia or Malaysia, our neighboring countries, at the
Mhm.
time of before the before the colonials arrived. It's not like we did not interact with each other.
And that
And
we
in
did
fact,
not have
most
our. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, BJ.
um, and in fact, it's the big differences that you can sense when you go to these different countries happen because of colonization. Not
Mm-hmm.
to say that we're the same, but more of we stopped interacting with each other when we became territories.
I think that since we've talked a lot about colonization, I did want to emphasize another thing that we've all been touching upon, but we haven't really like stated full out, or at least like not a lot. The This whole exercise of unearthing the tropics is a reclamation of power in a way, and how you do that in your design can uh, that could already be several different panels, or we need hours to go into it, because again, when you reduce the tropics to all of these nice terms, you are minimizing the entire filtora of experiences that come from the tropics. The weather in itself is different, the lay of the land will be different, the inherent tensions will be different, and it there are no set like values that you could just conveniently say, like when we say tropics we mean this, that, right? um One of the other if we go also to the colonial experience here, prior to the invasion of the colonizer, you'll see my lovely partner in the background because we're preparing breakfast, right? But like prior to the invasion of the colonizer, this land that you consider to be tropical had its own power, right? And it had its own legacies and its own people and its own definitions for certain lived experiences and contexts. When the colonizer came in, they BJ said it so well. They came in to impose order, but when they said order, they meant their order. They didn't mean our order. So what happened there? You have people who come out of the result of the trauma of this invasion depowered, because they are forced to no longer recognize what they knew to be powerful, and they become weak and small and minimized in the eyes of another person, the colonizer. And yet, where does all of that missing power go? Because it's not like you just suddenly stop being brown in the case of Southeast Asian people. There's still a lot of inherent tensions beneath the surface when it comes to being a colonized body. There are still the ideas of lost legacies of, or and even loss is a bit tricky, because can you really say that it was lost, or can you also say that it was fully your own, because since history changed the path of your country and the path of your people, and there's no such thing as a what could have been, right? We could try to do it in design, but it will never be approximate or perfect. And I think one of our big experiences, right, BJ and Sid Uno, was whenever we'd have to do pre-colonial research and people would ask for uh, convenient responses, because of course you have to you have to do things as a designer. You have to make sure that you get what you need. But whenever they'd come to us with those questions, we'd be like, the answer is not so simple, right? Because the funny thing with us is one of the seminal texts for pre-colonial history was written by a white man. And while he was a really, really good, accurate scholar, the fact remains that he was an outsider, and that tragedy occurred, at least in our context, because there was no one who could catalog pre-colonial Philippines the way he could among our own. We didn't have the language, we didn't have the political power to do it, we didn't have the cultural influence that allowed us in our own space to have a brown scholar treat our own things with due respect. We were lucky with William Scott and Barangay because he cared, but I don't think that it's the case for everybody else. So I'm also trying to grasp for like specific examples. I think BJ again might have more than me because you had to do the cultural consultancy.
Yeah, well, okay. So on Sina Una, my one of my roles was one of the researchers there, and like Pam said, it happened a lot. Wherein when asked the question, our answer was it depends. So, but in addition to um, the most proper treatise on pre-colonial culture was written by William Henry Scott, which is white, who is white. Our records from that time, the surviving records, are from the colonizers. Like the best period accurate piece we have for the Philippine context is something called the Boxer Codex. So the Boxer Codex, I actually have it here because I'm a Sina Una researcher. Uh, this was written in the late 16th century, around 1592 something, and this is transcribed to English already, but it was written in Spanish. And the intent was to convince the King of Spain to send more troops so that we could also conquer Japan and China. So that's the context of this book. So it's a very rich book with a lot of illustrations. I'll quickly show you one right now if I can find it. Yeah, here. So even the art, as beautiful as we find it, is colored by how the white people see us. So those are some things that we have to understand when we are reading this. And there's a lot of the savages are do this and that,
Yeah.
and the savages do. So when reading this as a Filipino, there's a lot of this guy has been dead for 500 years. Don't get too mad at him. Don't get too mad at him.
And but there's the thing, right? Even reaching the point where we can be mad that that was the definition of our own people, right? So you already have the act of needing to decolonize yourself as a designer because you've imbibed those things throughout history. And if you, for example, were like me when you were younger, your history teachers were not so nuanced when it came to encountering orientalized and minimized subjects, then you are already being depowered as a colonized body. Okay, so like we've talked a lot about like high level stuff. So let's go a bit into some like nitty gritty design things. I know that BJ in particular wanted to talk about monster design, and I wanted to talk about magical realism, which is a term that a lot of people are familiar
Aha.
with, but not a lot of people know how to define it. And it really, really it gets my goat as a literature teacher to get into this discussion all the time, especially since I'm not just a literary teacher, I am a brown person. So magic realism is a thing for us. So do you want to start, BJ, or should I go into tropical goth and magical realism?
Yeah, Tropical Gothic was the other one I wanted to flag.
But
And I
uh,
will cede the stage to you two.
okay,
Thank you,
so
Jason.
do you want to go for it first for
I
monsters as
think
well?
before we go to monsters, it would be nice to go to tropical goth because
Okay.
monsters I think are an extension of that.
Oh, that's true.
So
Okay, so the thing about tropical goth is I first mentioned it when I did a panel last year about the Dagger Isle supplement because tropical goth is the aesthetic that a lot of us are going for in the Dagger Isles. A lot of people were like, "I've never heard of that before," and of course, I'm not surprised to hear that because the thing with tropical goth is that in itself does not really have a unified definition. In fact, the only definitions that I found online were all from Latin America. And while my country in particular has a lot of resonance with the Latin American experience of imperialism and colonization, I would not presume to say that, hey, this definition is totally accurate to what we go through, because those are still two entirely different regions. Global South is literally half this globe, right? Like, I can't begin to say that we could universalize it that easily. So what I wanted to tell people about tropical goth is, let's focus first on the aspect of the sublime, which comes from gothic literature. The sublime is supposed to be a feeling of terror, of being inspired, but also being terrified and having a mixed sense of confusion, horror, and pleasure and pain all in one from experiencing external factors that are wider than yourself. Lots of big words, but if you really think about any of your Gothic literature favorites, you can kind of get it. Like that strange beauty that can be found in decay, or that whole interesting sensation that so many people go like, oh no, he's hot, when it comes to a horror villain, right? Those are some really like quick examples I like to throw in when it comes to tropical to what is gothic. Therefore, if you bring it down to the tropical goth, what are some specific aesthetics that we can think of when we go for that? In the Philippines, imagine uh, Catholic figurines done in more local flavors, right? Where if you had it in Europe, you'd have storms and dark clouds and Notre Dame's fires and rainy weather. For the Philippines, it could be a damn hot day because yes, I will say that it is hot, but at least I get to define that for myself, right? But you'd have a church made of coral, and you'd have moss grown over statues and like walls full of crosses, because that's something that we love as Filipino households. Like we can't just have one cross in here. We need to have multiple crosses to chase out the demons, right? And also like revere our ancestors. That's how we go when it comes to tropical goth. So on the other side of, or rather related to this, is the concept of magical realism. The Latin American l- literati who started the whole thing wanted to emphasize that for them, they don't really like the term magical realism. They prefer the marvelous real, right? For us on the Philippine end, it's so hard to ask us what we mean when, or rather we have a hard time when people ask us about our magical realism, because a running joke that I had in my department back when I was doing literature was, what is magical realism when that's actually our reality? Is the thing. People like to say that magical realism is like a slipstream thing where it could be totally normal, but there are fairies in the sky and everybody doesn't say anything about it, right?
that's
But if
just
you
every day.
yeah, exactly. So one of the anecdotes I wanted to share, because I think BJ and I've had so many conversations about this, and BJ had an excellent Twitter thread, I think, and a couple of discussions on Discord about magical realism. So I'll let him go into it after I talk about this anecdote for emphasis. Um, so when I first came to the Philippines after like 10 years of being away as a child, my what I noticed was whenever somebody would get sick in our household, um, it was equally it was equally proper to say you have a medical condition that can be diagnosed by a Western trained doctor to somebody might be cursing you because they don't like you. So there might be a mangkukulam is what we call it, where somebody who's literally going to hurl curses in your direction, and that's why you're sick. Or it could also be that some aswang attacked you at night and you didn't know. And if you talk to most people, they will say they'll just nod at you and go like, "Yeah, that's totally possible. If the doctor can't explain it, there must be an aswang. We need to get you some help." Right? And how can we even begin to say that that's magical realism down here when we just accept it equally as fact? And on the religious side, which adds to a bit more to the tropical goth stuff, we can talk about the Holy Spirit and God and Mary and Jesus and all that, but we can also say that there are demons and capre and all of our other mythical creatures existing all in the same space. And one of the most popular ways, at least in a lot of our literature, of dealing with them is you pray Catholic prayers in order
Oh,
to
not all of them
exorcise
like
them.
that.
Not all of them like that, but some of them do. So it's kind of like there's a strange marriage that's going in here. But anyway, I wanted to give the floor to BJ because he could talk a lot about cultural context and magical realism.
Okay, so I think to start with, a lot of the time when people consult me, and it's even in my bio, I talk about Philippine mythology and how I integrate that into RPGs. But even the term itself, mythology, is kind of weird because I think it was ZDXU from Malaysia who mentioned this before. Mythology sounds like it's a step away in the sense that this is not something that we experience because it's a myth, right? And we are, well, Pam and I are both from Manila or currently residing in Manila. And sometimes we do this as well because we are in the metropole. And as people in the metropole, these stories tend to be relegated as stories. Whereas, as Pam mentioned, generally, this is still treated as reality. And just starting from there, you can already see that there is some othering that is happening because when oops, sorry, I'm trying to find my words because I'm thinking in Tagalog suddenly. Give me a moment.
There's another experience, right? The untranslatable.
Yeah. So okay, so it's already othering because people will then tend to see, oh, they're thinking backwards. This happens even in the Maximo Ramos books, which is a book that a lot of people consult for mythology. He always emphasizes that, oh, when you're telling these stories to children, emphasize that they are not real, because otherwise they will think it's real, and that is not a progressive way of raising your children. That's already a thing because at the same time wherein people are telling us to treat the manananggals and the capres and all the other spirits of Philippine reality as unreal, we all believe that some dude 2000 years ago died for our sins and then resurrected 3 days later. I mean, if you can believe something like that, how is that a superior spirituality to the spirituality of passing by an anthill and paying your respects to the spirit who resides in the anthill? So that already is an unequal look at how things are. um, this also translates to monsters because when we talk about monsters, a lot of the time, because we do know as people who study sociology, that monsters are representations of what people fear, what people despise, even what people want but cannot do because society prevents them from doing so. And there's a lot of othering that occurs in that space, and that's actually one of the issues that we deal with when we're talking about our own monsters and rewriting it, because these stories were also made out of fear, and there's a lot of um I keep saying the word othering, but basically, even in our monsters, we have a monster called the Capre, which has very racist roots. And do we stop using the Capre because it has racist roots? I don't think that's fair, because the Capre today is no longer what the Capre was originally when the Spanish arrived. And yet we do have to explore what it means to have those origins. And that really comes into monster design when it comes to the the tropical goth, right? You have to keep the monstrousness of the creature, but at the same time point it towards today's sensibilities. So there. I don't know how to continue that now.
Well, one of the things that I remembered as well is monster design in RPGs tends to be a taxonomy, but that taxonomy once again is created by people
Oh,
who do not understand the specifics of the cultures that they are drawing from. There is no convenient taxonomy, for example, for Philippine lore and Philippine creatures. What's funny with us is I think like you and me and Joaquin and a whole bunch of other designers will always say Diwata is extremely difficult to translate into D&D terms because for us Diwata could most people capitalize on it being a cute little fairy, right? Which again is a reduction, when in reality a Diwata is a god of some sorts, but it could also be a spirit of some sorts, but it could also be a fairy of some sorts. So the untranslatable nature of our monsters prevents taxonomy, and yet design demands that you must find some kind of categorization for it. So your exercise as somebody who is designing is, how will you deal with that now? What kind of taxonomy fits your particular book? Because you can't just like grab from another source anymore. And if you're also in a system that already has that taxonomy, how then can you marry your need to represent and diversify the palette in front of you without going back to the same punishing reductive categories that you started with?
and actually, I have a boat to pick with taxonomy because, okay, the problem with taxonomy is that it is basing off of European fantasy most of the time when we're categorizing um what do you call this, cryptids, quote unquote, what they when okay, this is a cryptid of this variety. The problem is it usually goes into a western taxonomy, and then we try to fit things into that western milieu. One famous example of this is the Pinanggalan. It's a Malaysian creature that is pretty popular in a lot of fantasy books. You're going to see it. We're going to see it in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. That's old enough for me to mention, I guess. And you're going to see it in modern RPGs. And in most of them, this has gotten better. But in most of them, in the earlier ones, the Penanggalan is described as a Southeast Asian vampire. That already is very difficult, because now that you call it a vampire, now you have to classify it as an undead, right? And you now have to take in the baggage of being an undead. And since it's a vampire, then it must burn under sunlight, right? But that's not necessarily the case. It depends from myth to myth. So another example of that is famous is dragon. When you say dragon, okay, the dragon type is the Western dragon. You have wings. Yeah, you have wings. You have it breathes fire. It hoards treasure, and then but we also have Eastern dragons. And then and the Eastern dragon is a wise spirit. Blah blah blah. But we have to somehow factor in how it's also greedy, and it also wants to hoard things. And like, aren't you reducing one of our divine beings into your milieu? And And this doesn't even start. We're not even starting with the other dragon of the east, which is the Naga, which for some reason every other dragon gets to be high challenge rating, but the Naga is stuck in CR9.
And
So
I'm so glad you brought that up because
mhm,
that is a really concrete example of design as reduction rather than design as expansion. And the point of looking at how you could do design as expansion can touch upon not just the tropics, but literally any other concept that is not white. The what Since we're kind of going into like the end of the hour for our talk, and we touched upon like a whole bunch of like different little things you could go into. I wanted to emphasize the whole point about power. The think about When you think about the tropics, think about once again the power that was lost to the original subject, and the vacuum that has now been created as a result of that, and how that gets filled in, and with what. Because what often happens is the colonizer will fill it in with definitions that do not fit experiences that are not our own. And even as we struggle to articulate our own experiences, there's still a lot of power seated. There's still a lot of power underneath the surface that becomes the subject of things like, oh, what we mentioned with monsters, right? Like how people think that some people might consider all of our creations monstrous and yet also try to undercut it and go, but no, they're not that bad. They can still be conquered, right? This strange inherent tension that comes with dealing with legacies that are supposed to be your own lived experiences. And of course, when I say your own, I refer not just to me and PJ, but to anybody who might be watching this who is also from Southeast Asia or from any region that is reduced to the tropical, happy-go-lucky, idyllic nature experience, as people like to say. Do you have anything to add to that, PJ?
mm, nothing right now. I
Mm.
think you summed it up pretty well.
So I'm trying to think of possible questions, but if anybody has anything from the audience, like feel free. It's a shame that Mahar could not join us this time. Yeah, it's looking like he wasn't able to. So, give me a second. Um, what are the last things that I wanted to talk about when it came to unearthing the tropics? I think we've pretty much covered as much as we could in an hour, right? Because there's so many things that if we went into it, we need PowerPoint slides and presentations and more than an hour.
Yeah, something that I would like to add is that because I also try to represent RPG SEA, is that we are talking, both of us are talking from a very Philippine context, but this is also
Hmm.
something that that can be discussed from a Malaysian context, from an Indonesian context, from a Singaporean context, and if I remember correctly, one of the if we have aswang in the Philippine Melu, in the Malaysian and Indonesian spheres, we have the hantu, which is also its own bag that I don't want to really pry open because it's no longer my culture.
Yeah.
But when you see the hantu being described in current RPGs or RPGs of the past, they're usually described as, this is basically just another example. They're basically described as spirits,
Mhm.
and because of that, people start to think, oh, that means they're incorporeal. But no, a hantu actually passes by with a scent of jasmine, and there is a very visceral, like their guts sometimes will spill off and the blood falls onto the ground, and it smells like flowers. So
That's so metal though. That's like tropical goth. That's like tropical goth right there. Blood on the floor, but like the scent of flowers, right? Like what?
yeah, I've
Anyway.
actually seen this. I think there's a culture wherein they use jasmine
Mm,
to
mm,
to to wrap. the hair of the bride, and
Mhm.
basically it symbolizes their eternal love. But it also is the jasmine is also wrapped around their kris as they are getting married, because the kris symbolizes the intestines of your opponents.
I heard that from the people who were working on the Dagger Isle supplement for me. So yeah, I do recall that. Okay, we
So
have like one question before we start wrapping up. Would you do a supervillain evil lair on a tropical island? Personally, because most people, most Western audiences will will force that kind of dichotomy, I'd honestly try to avoid it in my design unless we're talking about this entire setting, like the Dagger Isles, is Southeast Asia. It's supposed to be representative of Southeast Asia. So it kind of equalizes the playing field. But if you ask me, like, hey Pam, can you write like a D&D module and like make sure that and you have this antagonist, I totally avoid going there because it just seeds into the whole thing that we're trying to avoid, the idea that antagonists, things to be conquered, people to be discovered, and realities to be subjugated, exists in the tropics, the place that is not civilized, that is wild, that is full of power that the other side must take for itself, right? So I personally wouldn't do it's a very, again, it depends question and has a lot to do with contextualization. What about
it
you, BJ?
it has to the supervillain lair to me has a very Dracula feel, which is to me not Southeast Asian, because the underlying thing about Dracula is this is the fear of your lord, your your lord who is not a part of the populace, lives away in his own castle and preys upon the common folk. Whereas our vampires, our aswangs, don't act like that. The mo of the aswang is that they are part of the community, and
Mm-hmm.
they are doing things that are taboo to the community, but they do not know it, or they represent things that you find icky, or actually um, sometimes they're also sensualized so that they can be representations of non-conservative values that you in person or outwardly don't want to show but inwardly desire. So
Mm-hmm.
that is very different. That is a very different villain to the villain who lives on his own despite his environment. So to me, I wouldn't do it.
And I think also like it would be very difficult for, at least for me, I suppose also for PJ, to deal with villainy in itself. I think that antagonistic things would be easier because there's a fine line more often than not in literature and even in design, right? When somebody says villain, you presume evil, but evil in itself is also a concept that you'd have to unpack, especially since evil usually means brown person for a lot of folks, or evil usually means black person, anything not white. Whereas if you deal with a wider definition of antagonist, then it becomes external opposing forces, external opposing ideas, things that are not necessarily fit and proper to a particular definition of society and what's acceptable.
Very
So
quickly to add to that, basically, I'm not so sure if this is quick. Abrahamic uh, evil is actually like a result of an Abrahamic context wherein you have sins and you will in the end be judged based on how much good and how much evil you have. There's a weighing scale. It might have some roots in Egyptian
mm,
mythologies, but this is not necessarily the reality for non-Western belief systems,
mm,
because prior to the arrival of Catholicism, our predominant culture was animist, and the idea with that is that you live in a world with millions upon millions of divine beings around you, and they don't really care about good and bad. They only have individual actions,
individual
and these
actions. Yeah.
actions comprise of the whole life that you have. So
Mhm.
thinking of it in terms of good and evil is already Western. If a thing about Southeast Asia, for me personally, is that it should be about um, whether a person does several bad things or several things that are considered problematic for their society, and weighing it against, no, I don't even want to use weigh it, because
Because that's also
it's not judgment,
yeah.
because We're not talking about evil persons and good persons. We're talking about a person that is capable of both harm and and
And good. Yeah.
and good.
Yeah. Okay, we have like 5 minutes. I guess now it's time for outros. I hope at least that this like small exercise of unearthing is giving people a lot to think about when it comes to their design. So for our outros, like we're gonna talk about our socials and like one thing or maybe two or three that we want people to be excited about when it comes to our personal projects or what we're up to. So BJ, go ahead.
Okay. As I've already mentioned, I am a researcher, writer, and game designer. Primarily focused on monster design for the Islands of Sinauna, which is a fifth edition campaign setting that is inspired by pre-colonial mythology. We try to keep it pre-colonial as much as possible, but like I already mentioned, that's very difficult when the sources are already colonized. And as to what you can expect from me from the future, I believe it Kickstarter backers already have it, but I wrote an adventure for Arc RPG by Momatos, which is called The Minting of the World. Um, it's actually very tongue in cheek. There's a colonizer that arrived, but this time it's from the perspective of the people who live there. How do you react to the arrival of a strong robot force? So check that out if you want. It's wonderfully illustrated by trying to remember Nina Martinez, if I'm not
Hmm.
mistaken. I could have forgotten. What else? I have several other things, but I think there's still an NDA, so I'll leave it at that. You can find me at bookajuice.games, or you could find some of my half baked ideas at bookajuice.itch.io. Most of them are free. The only ones that are not free are the ones that I complete, like Kakamania, which is a an exploration of the cockfighting culture of Southeast Asia, as well as the cock, the chicken, the male chicken, representing male pride and hubris. There you go.
So yeah, on my end, I'm Pam Poncelan. I think some of you guys might already be sick of me, given that this is my third and last panel for BBC. But I am a designer, editor, writer, community manager, and sensitivity reader and cultural consultant. My big work right now that I'd like all of you guys to look forward to, or I'm hoping all of you guys will look forward to, is Dagger Isle Supplement, which will kind of be my design manifesto. And this is the tropics. This is how you design the thing properly. Of course, this is not just my project. I'm surrounded by wonderful people from the RPGC that are all contributing their own lived experiences to this. And I just happen to be the girl who's trying to push it all together. So it won't just be my story; also be my partners. It'll also be everybody else involved in the project. And speaking of my partner, we do have a Powered by the Apocalypse game coming up. It's called Navathem's End. It's about agents who fight against the multiple ends of the world or the beginnings of thereof in a setting in a fantasy setting. So that's already in layout and it's going to be in the print run really soon. So you can find me in the socials for the Dovetailer everywhere. I also do my own streams also at the Dovetailer. So thank you for joining us. I think it was really, I hope you guys had fun. I hope you guys learned a lot.